Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Hope everyone can hear me well. Good morning, and thank you all for joining. And my name is Lauren Higgins. I am a program officer focusing on grantee engagement and research translation here at the Kauffman Foundation. I want to welcome everyone to the Spring 2020 Knowledge Challenge Showcase, which is a continuation of our Knowledge Challenge Showcase series that started last fall, focused on highlighting the work of the Kauffman Knowledge Challenge grantees. So what is the Knowledge Challenge, you might be wondering? The Knowledge Challenge is a biannual program that invites proposals for research activities to improve our understanding of entrepreneurship and generate practical, actionable, and rigorous evidence to inform decision-making and change systems. Today, you will hear from grantees from both the 2018 and the 2020 Knowledge Challenge grantee cohorts. The inaugural Knowledge Challenge grantees from 2018 were focusing on a number of topics. Just to kind of give a recap here, the 2018 grantees focused on the new nature of entrepreneurship, barriers to entrepreneurship, program design and policy interventions and implementation, and topics around ecosystem and external environment for entrepreneurship. In the 2020 Knowledge Challenge, there was a greater focus around research and practice collaboration in entrepreneurship research. And also some of the grantees and researchers were focused on inclusion in entrepreneurship research and specifically looking at how to increase the pipeline of more diverse entrepreneurship researchers. And in terms of today, you might be wondering what we're here to focus on. We're going to hear from seven different grantees across 2018 and 2020. And some of the topics that you'll hear about today are: one, how to facilitate more equitable growth in innovation systems, how local governments and policymakers can leverage entrepreneurship to support integration of refugees into their new communities, why incubators and accelerators should think beyond VC investment readiness when looking at how to support Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs in finding capital, how to motivate college and high school students to conduct community-centered research around entrepreneurship and become champions for new community knowledge. Also, we'll be looking at how understanding data and trends around independent contractors and gig workers can help our response to economic recovery and the changing nature of work. Also, why immigrant entrepreneurs are a missing part of many community and economic development strategies and how they play in building important community assets and supporting social well-being. And finally, what racial disparities in tech entrepreneurship mean for creating more inclusive tech ecosystems for ESOs, policymakers, educators, and other communities. These are just some of the topics that you'll hear about in our range of presentations today from the researchers as part of the Knowledge Challenge. And as a few final comments before I introduce our first speaker today, as I mentioned, there'll be 7 different speakers. Each will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. And then we'll have a period of Q&A after each speaker. So as you're listening, if you have questions around each of these individual presentations, clarifications, curiosities for the speaker and researcher, feel free to put those directly into our chat here. I see many of you are sharing where you're from and are already using the chat. So put your questions directly in the chat, and my team and I will help lift those up for the speaker during the each Q&A period. And then 2 final points. We are, of course, I hope it goes without saying, but I will say it, we are incredibly grateful to all of our grantees and the speakers here today and all the work that they're doing to advance the thinking around, well, generally our thinking around entrepreneurship, especially in these deeply complex, rapidly changing times. The role of entrepreneurship is quick changing, and it's wonderful that these folks are here thinking about how that role is evolving in our economy. And so we're very appreciative and grateful for them and their time with us today. And then as always, it's important to share that as the Kauffman Foundation, we host and provide these forums as a platform for an in-depth discussion on how to solve problems. And the Kauffman Foundation does not take a political position or a legislative position on these discussions. So with all of that housekeeping, I hope you feel oriented to what the Knowledge Challenge is, what it's covered in 2018, 2020, and some of what's on the docket for discussion today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker to kick things off. Again, we welcome you all here. We're very excited to have you for today's discussion. And with that, I will invite Dr. Rachel Atkins, who is the Provost Postdoctoral Faculty Fellow at New York University's Stern School of Business in the Management and Organizations Department, to be with us here today. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing about your work. Thank you so much, Dr. Atkins.
Well, good morning. Thank you to the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation for generously funding this project, and for inviting us all here today. I, along with Charlton McElwain, New York University Vice Provost and Professor, have been engaged in a project to expand research on racial equity in technology entrepreneurship by supporting and recruiting researchers to study the topic, and especially focused on researchers of color. There we go. The motivation behind this work stems from, first, what we know about the technology sector's sort of wealth-publicized issue in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Much of the general knowledge is with respect to employment in tech, but less is known about the state of DEI issues in tech entrepreneurship. There's a small but growing literature on this topic in the business and social science disciplines. Importantly, we had not seen research that comprehensively measured the extent to which there were racial and ethnic disparities in tech entrepreneurship, or what those trends might be like in the US. Other studies examined historical data on patents assigned to firms by race of the inventor. That's work by Lisa Cook. And other research examined trends in VC-backed entrepreneurship by race, which overlaps with, but is not equivalent to, tech entrepreneurship, and that's work by Gompers and Wang. And we believe that measuring diversity and inclusion in this space and documenting some stylized facts about the nature of racial disparities in tech entrepreneurship are the first step to understanding its causes and consequences. And we think that this line of research is important because of the disproportionate level of wealth generated by the tech sector and the implications of racial disparities in tech entrepreneurship for the racial wealth gap. Moreover, the racial composition of the owners and decision makers in tech also have implications for the types of technologies that are advanced in the economy, and whether technologies are interrogated to determine if they include or reproduce racial biases. So finally, high-tech industries are important with respect to employment growth. These are the types of businesses that create sort of well-paying jobs. And we have other research that suggests that people of color tend to hire other people of color. Thus, the implications for addressing tech's DEI issues in employment are evident. So in light of all of this, the goal of our project is to expand the body of research and also to diversify the pipeline of researchers addressing issues of racial equity in tech entrepreneurship. We instituted a two-pronged approach to accomplishing this goal. The first was to conduct some foundational research on the topic. As I mentioned before, we hadn't seen work that documented trends in tech entrepreneurship rates by race and ethnicity in the US. And so we did that using data from the American Community Survey from 2000 through 2019. We also collected and are reviewing the research on this topic across business and social science disciplines. We hope to expand our review to disciplines in the humanities as well. And we're also proposing a research agenda for future work. So a little bit about the analysis that we've done. The data we use, again, comes from the American Community Survey. We use data from 2000 through 2009, limiting our sample to adults aged 20 to 64. The ACS's large sample size allows us to drill down to self-employed workers in tech industries by race. However, despite its large sample size, we only have sufficient number of observations to evaluate Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white workers without disaggregating by nationality. So we don't drill down beyond those sort of larger categories. The ACS does, however, allow us to control for a rich set of individual demographic characteristics, and also to sort of do some additional analysis by those categories. The outcome variable that we are most interested in measuring here is the likelihood that a tech industry worker is an entrepreneur. We categorize self-employed workers as entrepreneurs, which is an imperfect but commonly used method in the entrepreneurship literature. We identify the tech sector in one primary way using categories that were created by Hecker at BLS. It's a commonly used criteria that comprises a set of NAICS codes. So we do some analysis looking at years 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, and 2019. On the left-hand side here is the racial composition of tech self-employed workers by race and ethnicity. Across all years, you can see that white workers comprise the larger share of those self-employed in tech industries. Their share peaked in 2001 at about 87% of all self-employed tech workers, and that share fell to 77% by 2019. Asian workers comprise the second largest share of tech self-employment throughout the first 2 decades of the 21st century. In the year 2000, 6% of tech self-employed workers were Asian. That share then jumped to about 9% from 2013 until it peaked to 10% in 2019. The third largest share of self-employed tech workers were Hispanic workers. 3% of self-employed tech workers were Hispanic in 2000. There was an uptick in 2001 when nearly 5% of workers were Hispanic who were self-employed in tech. Hispanic workers then comprised about between 6.5% and 7.5% of self-employed tech workers from 2017 through 2019. And finally, Black workers accounted for the smallest share in our analysis of self-employed tech workers out of the groups that we looked at. Black workers never comprised more than 4% of self-employed tech workers during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Interestingly, though, throughout this time period, relative to their shares of tech employment, which is shown on the right-hand side there, Asian, Hispanic, and Black workers were all underrepresented in tech self-employment. And I can say more about that in the Q&A, but for sake of time, I'll move on. So we also looked at self-employment rates, or the entrepreneurship rates within tech industry. Another way of saying that is the likelihood that a worker in tech would be a self-employed worker. And when examining rates among people of color relative to white workers, we observed greater disparities in entrepreneurship rates among Asian and Hispanic tech workers than among non-tech workers. So we've got non-tech self-employment there on the left and tech self-employment there on the right. I apologize for the scaling; it's a little off in this graphic, but the two sides are aligned. I just don't have the line going as high up on the tech self-employment side. And then with respect to Black workers, we see large entrepreneurship disparities in tech, but the magnitude of that disparity is actually smaller than in non-tech entrepreneurship. When we account for differences across racial groups and observed characteristics, that disparity does persist. For the sake of time, I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but a few interesting things that we did notice was that having a STEM degree was associated with a decrease in the likelihood of being self-employed in tech, while immigrant status was associated with an increase in the likelihood of being self-employed. So the second initiative within this project is our research workshop. The objective here is to convene scholars from across disciplines who are engaged in or interested in research on racial equity and tech entrepreneurship. Those engaged in research presently share their work and gain feedback. those interested in engaging in that work in the future are able to come and interact with folks who are already engaged in this work for the purpose of forming future collaborations. We had a wonderful meeting virtually last year, but are looking forward to hosting a hybrid meeting this year, which will be in Brooklyn, New York, and also online. We'll be at NYU's School of Engineering. I think I'm sort of running short on time here, but the dates are June 28th through the 30th. We'll have sessions where researchers present their work, panel discussions with entrepreneurs, policymakers, other folks in the ecosystem. But my favorite part of what we have planned are these networking and brainstorming sessions, which are intended to foster future research collaboration. So if any of you are interested, for those invited to come, we'll cover travel and accommodations, and folks who are not able to or who are not comfortable with in-person gatherings yet will also have the online option. So we hope that anyone on the call who's interested in participating, either presenting research or coming and just engaging with this community, I can put maybe in the chat, if that's possible, a link to the call, but you can also reach out to me at this email address. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I wonder if we can actually put that slide back up or share that contact information again in the chat, so that if people do want to contact you about that event, that they're able to do that. Either one, whatever is more comfortable for you.
I'll put it in the chat.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, let's make sure that we do that. So if people want to get involved, that they can do that. So while you're doing that, I think there's a couple questions that have rolled in. So let's take advantage of that as well. Let's take this first one here from Jacob Rosch, who says, "Such interesting work, Rachel. Thanks for sharing. What role does wealth play in disparities in self-employment?" From what you know.
Yeah, so great question. There's research, so I'm assuming racial disparities is what the question is with respect to. Research by Fairley and Robb suggests that wealth and access to capital are the single largest sort of determinant or factor that contributes to the racial gaps we see in entrepreneurship. One of the reasons why I am so interested in tech is because I think for some of the intuition or things that you hear, a lot of folks talk a lot about human capital deficits by race, and tech workers are a group that we think of as having a lot of human capital, and therefore potentially, even if they don't have a lot of personal wealth, they might be better able to access capital sources. And so the fact that we still see these disparities is something that I find that makes this a fertile ground to understand exactly how access to capital works, even when you have people who have human capital endowments that are sort of above average. And so we're hopeful that this research will give us some more answers about the mechanisms through which those disparities persist.
Thank you so much. Let's go to some of the next ones here. There's another one from Susan Cohen, who said, "Did you gain any insight into the major barriers to tech entrepreneurship for underrepresented groups?"
Sure. So this particular analysis is primarily designed to sort of give us a sense of the magnitude of the problem. There is some work. I'm excited for some of the papers that have already come in. So we're going to be exploring that topic at the workshop. So I hope that you'll apply to attend. But even a lot of the qualitative work that folks have done, where they're speaking with tech entrepreneurs, has shed a lot of light on this. Even my own conversations with tech entrepreneurs, there are a lot of difficulties accessing networks within the tech entrepreneur ecosystem. A lot of the just even being able to access clients, supply chains, obviously financiers. A lot of that is sort of just social network kinds of issues there. And a lot of the entrepreneurships I've spoken with and some of the qualitative research that I've read suggests that these sorts of barriers in social networks play a really big role. And that sort of spills over into all of the other things we think about in terms of, access to markets, access to capital, and so on. But this is a new space of research, and so our goal is to really begin to create a community that's going to answer those questions.
So I'm going to let's lift up this last question here. I actually have another one that came in outside of the chat. Do you find that geography plays a role as well? Tech funders seem to be especially geographically concentrated in a few places.
Yeah, so there's sort of two components to that. One is the geographic regions where we see these location economies for tech, and then there's the sort of geographic segregation of racial groups in the US. And so we do see these sorts of hubs of tech entrepreneurs in the southern region of the US. The city that comes to mind is Atlanta as sort of a hub for example, Black tech entrepreneurs. And then we do see more, we see larger Asian populations in the West, and also some pockets in the Northeast. And so one question that I think is a really interesting one to explore when we think about Asian populations' involvement in tech entrepreneurship, that geographic piece with their sort of co-location, that sort of where they happen to be located anyway, and then its correlation with the amount of activity in tech entrepreneurship. So I think that's actually a really interesting question about geography that is yet to be fully explored. And I did put both the call for abstracts and participation and my contact information in the chat for anyone who's interested in learning more.
Wonderful. It sounds like some of those questions can be carried into those convenings. So
absolutely. This is all the stuff we're hoping to talk about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I would encourage you, if there are any other lingering questions, if you want to just answer a couple of those last ones there in the chat. And then I think we'll just thank you again for your time. And I'm going to tee up for the next presenter. Thank you very much, Dr. Atkins. So our next speaker today is Dr. Annette Bernhardt, Director of Technology and Work Program at UC Berkeley Labor Center. So with that, looking forward to hearing about your work, Dr. Bernhardt.
Well, thank you so much. And it is a pleasure to be here with these amazing other projects. I want to thank the Kauffman Foundation for funding this project, and I'm presenting here on behalf of a whole host of other authors that you see on the screen. This project is a very unique partnership with the California Franchise Tax Board, which is California's state tax agency. It allowed us to get access to anonymized individual level tax data, about 18 million records a year for several years. It was an incredible project, tons of work. But today I'd like to focus on lifting up just a few of the key findings that we came up with. The goal of the study was to analyze individual taxpayer data to shed light on independent contracting in California, including on-demand platform work, commonly known as gig work. It was to provide the state tax agency with information about independent contractors to help with tax compliance. And it was to provide policymakers in California with rigorous research during what is currently a very active policy environment. I will flag for those of you who've been doing research on independent contracting and gig work, you'll know that there are a wide range of estimates about how common this work is, and that's largely due to very insufficient data. And so I will just say that the use of tax data to speak to these questions has really been a revolution in the research arena, our ability to access tax data for these purposes. quick definition, how we're defining independent contracting. We use the term very broadly because that's how it has been used in the California policy debates. We include all forms of independent contracting in our analysis. So folks who either filed sole proprietor tax filings and or who received a 1099 form. I can talk more about the details of that during Q&A if people are interested. This definition encompasses, but is much broader than gig work for online platform firms. And I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. So the most important question really that we started out with was, what is the prevalence of this work? And in 2016 was the last year that we had reliable data for. But you'll see that the large majority of workers in California still had a traditional W-2 job and only had a W-2 job. Second, that around another 9% of workers combined W-2 work with independent contracting. And then another 9% or so relied on independent contracting only in 2016. And this middle category actually is one of the innovations of using tax data, of being able to identify workers who are mixing W-2 work with independent contracting. Often those workers are either put only in the W-2 box or are lumped in with other independent contractors. And so that is a very important category that we've been able to pull out, and is especially important for some of the policy debates around what kinds of needs do independent contractors have. This graph looks at just those mixers, again, mixing W-2 and independent contracting income, and looks at the share of their income that is coming from the independent contracting. And you'll see at the bottom here, overall, independent contractor income only accounted for around a little bit more than 4% of their overall earnings. And so the modal mixer here is really somebody who is mainly doing their W-2 job and then is doing independent contracting on the side for supplemental income. But that pattern does vary across the wage distribution. And you'll see for low wage mixers, in fact, the independent contracting income is a lot more important to them than for the higher wage workers. Another interesting finding was that a lot of this sort of mixing of W-2 and independent contracting work is transitory. So here we're looking at folks moving from 2015 to 2016. And we find that almost half of mixers had moved to another, in 2015, had moved to another status in 2016, whereas W-2 workers largely remain W-2 workers, and independent contracting only workers, folks who are only relying on independent contracting, mainly largely remained in that status. So that is really a sign, again, that a significant portion of this group, this is not a permanent state, it's a very fluid state. We also looked at time trends. We only had 3 years of reliable data. We looked at time trends in these categories and found very little change over time. And I would flag that this has been sort of contrary to some of the, some of the outside stories that you hear in the media. In the research community, it has been hard to find evidence of an explosion in gig work and independent contracting, whatever label you want to put on it. It has been very hard to find that even with a longer time series. It is the case that you can definitely in the data pick up an increase in gig work in particular. There's no doubt it has grown significantly, but as we'll see shortly, gig work really represents a very small percentage of the workforce. And so overall, we don't see a dramatic explosion in independent contracting, which I think is an important thing to understand for policymakers and also to continue to track. We looked at also at the earnings of these three groups of workers, and there's a lot of information on this slide. I mainly want you to look at the last column and to see that workers who only rely on independent contracting definitely on average have lower earnings than the other two groups of workers. Now, I will say there's a big caution on this slide because we do not have information on hours worked. And it may be that in part, this last column of workers potentially are, last year they were, spending some of the time unemployed and only were able to do independent contracting for part of the year. So there's a big error band around this, but it is an indicator, an early indicator, and we have this from a few other studies, that there is definitely a sizable low-wage population among independent contractors. One of the other things we were able to do, which I think was very important, I think will be especially of interest to this audience, is we broke down the different types of independent contracting, again, using that term broadly, into three distinct groups. And found that, and this may not come as a surprise to some of you, that a substantial number, more than half of this group, did not receive a 1099. And so while we tend to think of non-W2 employees, often in the policy debates at least, as being largely 1099 freelancers, in fact, there's significant numbers of folks who are, what you might term unincorporated self-employed or sole proprietors, although I would flag that this group is very diverse. And I think we have a lot of research to do in understanding it. The obvious other statistic to lift up from this slide is that in 2016, 1.4% of workers in California had done some sort of work for an on-demand platform like Uber, Lyft, et cetera. That often comes as a surprise to people. I would flag that in all of the rigorous research that has been done on gig work, researchers consistently come up with small numbers like this. It is an important new form of work, there's no doubt, to focus on in terms of public policy, in terms of the discussion around entrepreneurship, et cetera, but we should understand that this is still a very, very small percentage of the workforce. And then finally, just to give another illustration of the power of tax data and also how it can give unusual insights, just focusing on these gig platform workers, we were able to look at how many different platforms do they work for. And it turns out that the large majority are only working for one platform, which again is a little bit contrary to some of the accounts in the media, which paint a picture of platform workers, working for 5 different platforms and having all their apps open on their iPhone. And that's not, there's definitely a subset who are doing that. But at least in 2016, that was not yet the main way that people were engaging in platforms. So there's a ton of other findings that we had, but I'm mindful of time. And so one of our major conclusions from this project is how important tax data can be, and in our minds should be, in terms of informing labor market public policy discussions going forward. Tax data, especially, and I flag here, this is important, if combined with other data, can help us understand the safety net needs of independent contractors, which of course became a major topic during the COVID pandemic. Definitely can help track trends in independent contracting, both in terms of the workers who engage in this work and the firms who hire them. I did not show that analysis, but we began to dig into taking the lens and shifting it to the industries and the firms who hire independent contractors and gig workers. What can we learn about them? The data can help us assess the impact of significant policy changes, since states are increasingly acting to pass public policies around this type of work. It could help us conduct better research on misclassification, which is a very significant issue. And then, of course, for tax agencies, it can help measure tax compliance and the size of the tax gap. And I would say, just to finish, that we are, I believe we're the first state that has attempted this type of very unique collaboration, and we would be more than happy to support researchers in other states who are interested in exploring the ability to do this type of collaboration with their state tax agency. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Annette. And I want to just highlight a couple of the questions that have come through. So let's start with this first one here from Frank Fawson. How important do you think it is that independent contractors might not report all their income for tax purposes?
That is an excellent question. Our understanding from the audits that the IRS has done is that for independent contractors who get a 1099 form, compliance is actually quite high. The problem is for people who do not get tax forms. I will say the strength of our project is that we were able to see the 1099 tax forms, even if the workers did not declare them on their tax return. And there was a significant chunk of workers who got 1099s, especially from the gig platforms, but then did not report it on their tax return. But we were able to see it and therefore count the income.
Thank you. And maybe I'll pull another question that came through. Are there any indications that there have been any changes in work arrangements since 2016?
Great question. I think for folks who've been tracking data on self-employment broadly, you will know that self-employment tends to be strongly moved around by business cycles. And in terms of the gig platforms, what we're learning is that the use of platforms is sort of a shock absorber by folks. So in normal business cycles, our sense is that you will see an increase in the use of platforms. In this particular pandemic-induced recession, of course, because of the nature of it, we saw a steep decline in the use of platforms and in small business formation, just because the economy went into hibernation, with the exception, of course, of the delivery gig platforms. So like rideshare went down, a lot of the other types of gig platforms went down. The start of business creation early on went into hibernation. But then we saw a real uptick in new business starts in general, and in the types of service that you might think would be needed, like food delivery. I will say there's been a lot of misreporting on this in the press, and I think the Kauffman Foundation in particular has put out some really good data on this. My understanding is that we are just back at pre-recession levels in this activity, even though obviously a lot of workers who lost W-2 jobs attempted to try to use independent contracting to fill the gap, but the overall decline in economic activity was so large that did not make up for we did not see an exceeding of pre-pandemic levels in this category of workers. And I think, just to quickly say, I think there are big questions about what the world will look like going forward. Obviously, there's a lot of hypotheses that workers may come out of, may permanently have made a permanent shift to independent contracting, et cetera. I think we will have to wait and see.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bernhardt. There's a couple of other good questions in the chat, which I'll point you towards if you have some time before you depart, but I want to thank you again for your time and your presentation today. And with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So thank you again. Our next speakers actually are focused on building accelerators to support Black and Hispanic community entrepreneurs. And I'm going to welcome Professor Heather Cameron. And then also maybe during our Q&A, we will hear from Bukola Apata, a teammate of Professor Cameron. So with that, thank you very much and looking forward to hearing about your work.
Great, welcome everybody. I'm Heather Cameron from Washington University in St. Louis. I'm excited to share a project that I've been leading with Bukola Apata and also our partners, WePower. So also a big thanks, of course, to the Kauffman Foundation for supporting our work here. WePower, for those of you who haven't had the chance to see their work, is a very impressive NGO based in St. Louis, and which I'm just going to kind of leave it there for time, but I encourage you to take a look at their website, which we'll put into the chat. They've got a focus on building community wealth and have built an accelerator focused on Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs, especially those from the north part of our city, which, like many American cities, is unfortunately still scarred by systemic racism and a huge residential segregation, which of course then plays into where economic activity is. So our questions were around how can the St. Louis entrepreneurial ecosystem support a greater number of Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs in everything, but especially in accessing capital. Because of the deindustrialization in St. Louis, many of the anchor institutions are making very big bets on entrepreneurial development. So we have a large plant science center, which was supporting the work of Monsanto, now Bayer. We have different biotech and now spatial sort of spatial tech accelerators, which are being put into place. But again, this leaves a lot of people out. So we're also interested in to see how standard models of acceleration and in inviting people to take part, how they work and how they don't work. So our study was looking at different, so it's a qualitative study. So unlike Rachel and Annette, we're doing more of an exploratory work with different semi-structured interviews where we talked to people in the investment space, and the philanthropic investment space, also to all of the different incubators working with Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs throughout the Midwest, up to Chicago and down all the way to New Orleans. And then speaking with them about how they understand the value of accelerators, what some of their challenges are, and how we need to make them fit for purpose. So we spoke to 38 people in total for longer expert interviews, as well as the standard sort of literature review and so on. They were obviously mainly Black and Hispanic in terms of the entrepreneur demographics, and skewered just slightly male. What's also interesting for us in St. Louis is that we need to be thinking, we need to be thinking about, there we go. We need to be thinking about where things take place. One of the stated goals for WePower was to have more economic activity and more entrepreneurs committed to developing the community in North St. Louis. So you can see from this map, the green areas being majority Black, the blue areas being majority white, and the yellow areas being somewhat mixed. That they were successful in creating at least 4 ventures. Again, we've plotted where their place of business is registered. So again, a lot in the downtown core, just because of the basically lack of any sort of commercial real estate infrastructure north of the unfortunately infamous Del Mar divide, that black line, which basically has separated our city for too long. So what we found out, which is probably not hugely surprising to some people on this call, but seems quite surprising to other people running accelerators, is that of course most entrepreneurs don't fit a VC model. There's a huge mistrust in the population that we spoke to in terms of loans and equity, not understanding necessarily equity or the need for it, and then mistrust of financial institutions, which shouldn't surprise anybody. That there was quite a challenge reaching a living wage, which in St. Louis would be over $30 an hour, both for the founders, but also for their staff. and then the importance of shared service and the importance of creating incubators and entrepreneurial communities which are more inclusive and are fit for purpose. So the first point, again, part of this is around where we draw the circle around who is an entrepreneur. I also teach at the business school, and there's this sort of throwaway comment sometimes about, oh, those are lifestyle businesses, those aren't entrepreneurs. I'm like, anybody who manages to feed their family from their business activity, I would consider an entrepreneur. So coming out of this, we're thinking, how do we create more pilot models about revenue sharing models, royalty models, hybrid philanthropic investment models to fund these entrepreneurs? There's definitely the intent in St. Louis to raise more people up. How do we get the money to them? So for example, one of our speakers, I'm all about building wealth. I'm a family man, so I want to pass this down to my kid. So I'm not with equity, you know, it's not for me. I don't want to feel like I don't have no power in my business. I put in my blood, sweat, and tears. And this person's actually an urban farmer, so much more than just his blood, sweat, and tears. So again, as we think about generational wealth, how do we include entrepreneurs in this space and understand their reasonable hesitations? So again, following on that theme about loans, so how, again, can we think of new ways to reinterpret the risk-reward ratio? Some of you who were able to join us yesterday at our investors roundtable, we had some really interesting thoughts about revenue-based repayment systems, as well as thinking about what sort of education do we need to do for investors and funders. We talk a lot about educating the entrepreneurs, right? But what sort of education are we doing for funders and investors that makes them potentially rethink the risk-reward ratio? Why is it absolutely normal that even philanthropic funds are expecting 10% on their fixed interest, on their bonds, et cetera? If we could have them think of a much wider blended return, we'd have a lot more money in this space, which would also allow people to develop tools like different equity buyback models, where then people are more comfortable having a co-owner when they know it's for only a certain amount of time. Yeah, so I love it. We're working with some cooperatives now, which is very exciting. So I'm not really open to VC funds, hedge funds, stuff like that, because we're worker owned. Okay, awesome, go for it. Obviously, this is a space which is growing, the whole co-op space. Rockefeller and others in the Catalytic Capital Collaborative are doing research. And so I think we're going to be hearing more and more about how we think about entrepreneurship in a co-op frame. All right, living wage. Again, we just have to make sure that we're not hyping ourselves too much. It's not possible for most entrepreneurs, even my like fancy high-tech white guy tech bro entrepreneurs, to be getting a living wage within the sort of frame that is often expected. So I think it's important that all of us who are trying to create more inclusive systems be realistic about the time that's expected, so that we can also make proper projections which show transparency and gain trust. Shared back office services, or just a shared services model, very important. We just heard from Annette about the importance of tax reporting and whether or not everybody's actually taking that seriously. I think it's often the case that smaller scale community entrepreneurs are constantly working in their business and not on their business, because there's so many things you need to think about, especially if you're doing some sort of like online distribution, etc. So by WePower investing in other people in our community here in St. Louis and in other cities, investing in basically finance, legal, marketing, HR, back office systems, which are then allowing some degree of economies of scale. People get access to talent without having to pay for it. And again, sometimes entrepreneurs don't know that they need it, as an entrepreneur myself. And so by explaining the importance of good HR policies, by explaining the importance of course, tax compliance right at the beginning, some of the hurdles that come up get avoided. So again, just understanding the community that we're dealing with. Things which are traditionally taught about money and business and higher income or privileged households were not taught to me, and they're not taught to people with backgrounds that I come from. So again, that's not me speaking as a professor, white female professor, but a lot of the people we talked to, this was the first time that they'd thought about again, understanding their loan terms and things like that. And that's not that surprising, because we really have a system which rewards, which kind of enforces ignorance for a lot of people until they're told to pay their student loan bills. All right, so again, as we can imagine, thinking about customizing it. people getting away from a more extractive understanding of investment, but ways that where basically some businesses are seeded, but when they're successful, they're pulled out, or that it's only businesses which are doing things which the community would argue are not in their interest, for example, liquor stores or guns or dollar stores or some of these types of franchises, which they say is not supporting their community. So again, how to be intentional about investing in entrepreneurs that have plans focused on community building. This is a different way of thinking about the value of entrepreneurship, but as someone who's located in a school of social work, social policy, and public health, as well as teaching at the business school, I think it's extremely important to be thinking about what are we using entrepreneurship for, and to get it away from just being an individualist endeavor. So how are we designing things which are for us, by us? So again, sort of these are our main takeaways in terms of looking at the incubators and entrepreneurs, about scaling alternative finance models, making equity agreements more transparent, offering buyback, thinking more realistically about time to profitability, demystifying and encouraging shared service models, and again, aligning programs with preferred outcomes. So coming out of this, we've developed new questions. We're kind of in the middle of our project, like many of you, but we're going to be looking further at alternative financing models. We had a great talk about revenue-based financing. What's the role of philanthropy in these hybrid investment models? Where does philanthropy fit in the stack? And again, how can communities, I'm saying intervene, but how can communities shape entrepreneurial ecosystems to advance inclusive prosperity? I'd like to, again, thank the Avig Marion Kauffman Foundation for their support, and also our wonderful friends at WePower. And then Bukola and I are here to answer any questions. Bukola is the research manager for the project.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Bukola. Let's see what we've got going on. Well, and also, Bukola, thank you so much for sharing some more of the context around the work in the chat, some of the convenings you did recently and some other information. So everyone who's on the call, please take a look there as well if you want to find out more of context and information and follow-up from what they just shared. There was one great question that came through so far from Susan Cohen. I'm curious what you learned about the role and efficacy of philanthropic investment in St. Louis. In my region, there's a lot of foundation investment, but a sentiment is that it largely goes to established institutions like universities, and entrepreneurs don't feel a direct benefit.
Yes, well, that's part of the challenge about the way philanthropists think they can deploy money. And it is not possible directly for philanthropy, if they want a tax receipt, to give it to a for-profit enterprise. And so what more innovative people are doing are creating things like Arch grants, which we can put a link into, or again, the YouthBridge Community Foundation are working with community development financial institutions to basically bank their money at a community bank, and then the community bank can give it out to for-profit ventures. Or they're investing in an entrepreneurial competition like Arch Grants, which, even though they're a 501c3, are able to give $75,000 in non-dilutive investment to entrepreneurs. So it's partially, so thanks for the question, but it's like partially a legal question, Susan, how you can set up a vehicle. And then secondly, it's about philanthropy understanding that they can achieve what they want to achieve in the community through entrepreneurial means, and for us to make that case. So it's not just about giving help to a kindergarten or subsidizing visits to a kindergarten, but instead maybe helping the woman running the kindergarten so that she's able to do a more efficient business model, so it's more sustainable, or that she can open up another site, which is another thing that was done here in St. Louis with philanthropic money invested into an entrepreneur. Final thought on this, we heard great things from our friends at Mission Driven Finance about how philanthropy is part of their investor stack, right? So philanthropy foundations and so on will invest in the fund, sometimes kind of sacrificial, right? That they won't get their return. They'll be like the first people who lose money. But what it does do is it brings other money into the stack. And so that's how we've seen philanthropy have an effect. is again, either that they bank with people who lend it further, they create a legal structure where a nonprofit supports entrepreneurs directly, or they're investing in funds in order to bring more money in. And so everybody wins in that model.
Wonderful. Well, I encourage anyone else who might have interest in engaging to follow the links that were shared there. Any final thoughts or comments before we move on to our next presenter?
Well, maybe Bukola, if you want to share a little bit about what we did yesterday and how people can be involved there.
Great.
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Bukola. I'm the research and program coordinator with Dr. Cameron at Washington University. So yes, yesterday we hosted about 50 stakeholders, funders and investors across America, which was great. So I've put some links in the chat. So if you guys just want to grab the links, I would press that we all join our LinkedIn group. There was something that came out from the call yesterday, and if you can watch that, is a policy that we are thinking about and we're excited about. We had Josh Silva yesterday from the National Reinvestment Community Development, and then and this policy is about a new policy that in 2 or 3 months that will come out, that they are going to need people to comment on and vote on. And when you're a part of our LinkedIn group, you have access to that and just connect and network with people that are working in the capital asset space. Let me see, what else do we have here? And also our research publication is up on SSRN. I think I have the link in the chat, so please, we have limited time to talk about our findings. What Dr. Cameron shared is just like top 5 of our findings. We have other sub-themes and things that obviously you might be interested in. So you can grab the paper and download and view that. And also I'm going to put my email in the chat, and Dr. Cameron is going to do that as well. So please reach out if you want to connect, if you have questions, we are here.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much.
Thank you all.
With that, I'm going to welcome our next speaker, who will be talking about entrepreneurship to empower refugees in Central Ohio. I'd like to welcome Dr. Andrea Kotijani.
Well, first of all, thank you, Lauren, and thank you everybody at Kauffman for organizing this event. It's really, really interesting to hear what everybody else is working on. My name is Andrea Contigiani. I'm an assistant professor at the Ohio State University, and I'll talk to you about what we like to call the New American Entrepreneurship Project. I'll start very briefly. I don't want to make this too boring, but I'll start very briefly from some older research. There's a lot of research, especially in economics and in business, looking at the intersection between immigration and entrepreneurship. A lot of this starts from this idea that's been common, that ethnic diversity is really a key driver of Silicon Valley's innovation. And there was some interesting statistics a few years ago from Forbes. Over half of the so-called unicorns have at least one founder who is an immigrant. And so this is, of course, something that researchers have been looking at. Fairley and Lofstrom review a lot of the research in economics on this, and they write that immigrants are widely perceived as being highly entrepreneurial and important for economic growth and innovation. And very recently, there was another piece that looked at some new data, some more granular data, this work by Azulea and colleagues, and they write that immigrants act more as job creators than job takers and play outsized roles in US high growth entrepreneurship. So this idea is well established. However, it seems to me that it seems to us that a lot of this literature looked at one part of the immigration phenomenon, and in particular, they look at high-scale voluntary immigration. And there's actually a whole other part of immigration that we haven't really studied that much in the context of entrepreneurship. That's forced immigration. Right now, sort of the word that people use to define this is forced displacement. And that's essentially the movement of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee their home country to avoid the effects of conflict, situations of violence, violations of human rights, natural human-made disasters. Obviously, there are a lot of crises around the world that are driving this phenomenon. Obviously, sadly, the last bullet point on the list is the Ukrainian crisis that is generating another refugee crisis in Europe just over the past few weeks. The US has been very generous with refugees from around the world. Since the passage of the Refugee Act, the US has admitted over 3 million refugees. And again, refugees are only a component of the broader forced displacement movement because they have a special legal status. But that is just a piece of data that I think it's really interesting to really keep in mind. And just very briefly, this is data from the UN High Commission for Refugees. It essentially shows how the number of people that are to be considered forcibly displaced has doubled over the past decade. We now have more than 80 million, and this doesn't include the past year and a half, which where this trend has continued to increase, including for some of the past events. I should also point out this is also partly driven by climate-driven refugees, which is a phenomenon that we've seen increasing over the past few years. So this phenomenon is growing around the world, and this is sort of where we decided, how we decided to start this project. And the motivation is essentially that the inclusion of refugees and other refugee-like immigrants, other forcedly, forced immigrants, is a challenge in the US, as it is obviously in several other Western countries. This is a project that we started with 3 colleagues, Fabrizio Dell'Acqua at Columbia University, Arati Maleku here at Ohio State, and Sehun Ho also here at Ohio State. The hypothesis that we essentially have is that entrepreneurship can be a route for these folks to really achieve their potential. And while this idea hasn't really been looked at in economics, there is actually a literature in sociology. Porter New is an interesting work that looks at this, that really shows how empowering refugees to become entrepreneurs helps them, but also has a very large impact on the community around them. The way we're going to do the study is essentially through field work, and I'll talk about the details in a second. I'm very happy to really, I'm very grateful to all of the partners that are helping out, obviously the Kauffman Foundation first, but also the Ohio State University, the City of Columbus, Rev1, which is a Columbus-based accelerators, and the 3 refugee resettlement organizations based in Central Ohio, ETSS, BCCO, and us together. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but this is sort of the logic model that we are that we use as a guide in this work. And essentially what we're trying to look at, how providing entrepreneurship training, so helping refugees to become entrepreneurs, affects essentially 4 classes of outcomes in the long term. Their propensity and their performance in entrepreneurship, their economic well-being more broadly, their social well-being, and their mental well-being. And then through that, we want to look at how this affects the community more broadly, including in terms of economic growth in the area. Might be running out of time. I'll be very quick here. We are taking 3 steps. The first step is a large survey. We did this the last fall. We have over 500 responses. And the way we use that survey is to really understand the key patterns in the institutional barriers that refugee faces in starting businesses. And we also obviously use that survey to recruit individuals to focus groups and then the training program. Step 2 is the series of focus groups that we are currently doing, which is a way to really use that, sort of to really get some qualitative evidence, to really understand those barriers a little more deeply, and obviously use that information as an input in the design of the training program. And then finally, the training program, which we plan to conduct this fall. And that will be essentially a way to run a randomized trial, which should help us estimate the impact of the training program on the situation of the refugees, broadly speaking. Happy to go into details about anything here in the Q&A section. Very briefly, again, we are just starting really to look at the data. Some very, very preliminary findings that I like to emphasize. Some of the institutional barriers that we have perceived to be important for refugees are access to capital. Of course, that's not surprising. A lot of entrepreneurs, and some of the previous talks have emphasized that as well. A lot of these entrepreneurs that are not coming from, let's say, a mainstream background, face barriers to accessing capital. This is, in this setting, also a consequence of the type of business the refugees tend to start, which are businesses that are now typically attractive to a lot of the mainstream investors. Of course, there is an issue of institutional complexity. The legal requirements to start and then operate a business are complicated in this country, as they are in many other countries, and this is especially difficult for people who come from a completely different setting and background. Language turns out to be a really important barrier, even for people who actually speak English at some conversational level, because many times in pitching to investors, the language is disproportionately important. And finally, this part somewhat unexpected to us, there's a number of psychological factors that we didn't expect. We had a focus group a few weeks ago, and there was a Nepalese woman who talked to us about how there is really a confidence issue that makes a lot of the refugees, makes it hard for a lot of refugees to really approach investors and other stakeholders in their business. It's something that we're trying to understand more. Of course, gender does play a role, as we understood from that conversation. This is just a really sort of broad overview of some of the patterns that we're looking at. A lot of this needs to be really looked at in more detail. I suspect I need to wrap up quickly, Lauren.
Yes, go ahead. And then I have one question for you. So yeah,
sure.
Please wrap up and then we'll head over that.
I'll wrap up very quickly. The bottom line here is that providing a standard training program is not probably going to be effective. We need to really think about a program that helps reducing some of these barriers. And this is kind of what we're trying to understand at the moment. We have a lot of next steps moving forward, including scaling both this survey and the training program. We are very happy to talk to anybody who's interested in this space, and we would love to partner. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe one question I have here is, can you share about engaging with community partners and the refugee population, and any lessons around that for other researchers?
Yeah, so we took a very community-based approach in doing that. So we started, and I really actually want to give credit to two of my co-authors who are actually in the College of Social Work here at the Ohio State University, because they really, I learned a lot from them in terms of taking this approach. So we started by talking to these organizations whose job is essentially to really help refugees settle into the area. So they take refugees when they arrive to Columbus, give them houses, help them buy cars, help them find a job. And for us, you know, it was tricky. It would have been very tricky to approach that population. This is a population with very specific needs, obviously. And so it would have been really hard to, I think, to approach them without the help of this organization. So the approach that we took was we talked to them first, and they were sort of the key connection between us and the community. And then after that, you know, that helped us, I think, learn about the community and also help the community sort of start to trust us. And that made this whole project a little easier. So this is the approach we took. I'm not sure, there might be other approaches, but we kind of proceeded that way.
Wonderful. Well, I think we'll take that as our final question. Thank you very much for your time and your presentation today. And feel free to drop your contact also in the chat if you'd like other folks to follow up with you about the work that you're doing, and really appreciate your time and presentation.
Thank you.
Great. So I will open it up to our next presenter today, who's going to talk about the social push and the direction of innovation. This will be with Dr. Josh Fang, who I'd like to welcome, and looking forward to hearing more about your work.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. I know it's been like so many great talks already, some of them setting up some of the themes of the research that we're trying to do, but I'm just really grateful for the Kauffman Foundation support and like putting on these showcases to share our research, and also for me to kind of learn from other researchers. So this is joint work with Eliash Ainio and Xavier Yaravel, and it's called the Social Push and the Direction of Innovation. So today I'm only going to be able to give kind of the Cliff Notes version of the paper. I've put the link to an older draft of the paper in the chat. And then I'm also just very open to any suggestions and comments and whatever you're willing to share by email or in the chat. So thanks again to everyone. So just to give a little bit of background from kind of the view I'm coming from. So the direction of innovation is an issue that's of great interest to innovation scholars, to economists, and to policymakers. It's just a kind of technical way to describe like what kinds of new goods is the innovation and entrepreneurship system producing for the broader population. And so that's kind of the big picture issue. And in our paper, what we try to do is empirically assess whether innovators' social backgrounds affect the types of goods and services that they create. So we've dubbed this the social push channel, but better, we're also open to kind of better terminology on that front. And to back up a little bit, so first, why might we think that this channel exists? So just from reading inventor and entrepreneurship profiles and various case studies in the literature, it seems like innovators draw from their own experiences when creating new goods, new technology, new businesses. So here I've shown Josephine Cochran, the inventor of the dishwasher, and she was kind of part of the upper class community in America and needed to wash her like fine china without breaking them. And she was like, oh, I might as well just invent like a dishwasher and like all my friends can use it. And so that's kind of the origins of the dishwasher. But there's many other inventor profiles out there that they draw from ideas coming from their own experiences. And so that's why it might exist. In terms of relevance, so why might we want to like study this particular issue? Well, so as many of the previous speakers alluded to, there's underrepresentation of certain groups in the US innovation system. So women, minorities, and people from certain geographic areas are not getting as much funding, not undertaking as much entrepreneurship. And so here, this is the poster on the tech industry, which some of the earlier speakers talked about in much greater detail. And so if you combine those two ideas, then potentially consumers from these underrepresented backgrounds and regions are getting fewer new goods, or that's kind of economists speak for like, is the innovation system basically not solving as many of their needs? And so our approach is is to kind of put data to this question. So what we do is we collect data on entrepreneur characteristics, and then we try to link entrepreneurs to the consumers that they end up selling to or serving. And so we do this both at the product level. So some entrepreneur starts a business, manages to get a product to market. We can see in some contexts what the characteristics of the consumers that buy their product looks like. We also do this at the industry level, focusing on consumer-facing industries. So there's about like 350 of those based on the on a common classification. And then you can see, well, the people working in the industry have this profile, or like the entrepreneurs have a particular profile, and how does that relate to the consumer profile in that industry? And so what we do essentially is to compute correlations between consumer characteristics and innovator characteristics. So for example, are older entrepreneurs more likely to create goods that are sold to older consumers, or woman to woman, people from higher income backgrounds selling to people with higher income? And so we've documented a series of results, which you can see in the paper. This graph basically illustrates what we're trying to do. So this is from the phone app setting. We're looking at startups that create phone apps. Each phone app is a data point in this analysis. And so we classify these phone apps as being created by woman-founded companies versus male-founded companies. And then we plot the fraction of usage coming from female users from on their phones. And what we see here is that the red bars, which represent the female usage of female-founded startups apps, is kind of shifted to the right versus the male-founded startups. So on average, woman-founded startups make apps that have about 20% more women consumers than male-founded startups. And again, like backing up, the context is that like 16% of phone app startups have 1+ woman founder, and only 5% are all female. So that kind of speaks to the original motivation for our research. We've also done this at the industry level, and this is finding kind of illustrating that entrepreneurs who have parents with high income end up working in kind of luxury industries, starting businesses in luxury industries, and then people from who have slightly lower parental income are more likely to start industries in necessities industries. And so as I mentioned, the paper documents a series of results, which might be, depending on where you're coming from, there might be different results that kind of are relevant to you, but we find kind of generally a very strong similarity between innovators and their customers. This holds within product groups, so kind of within dating apps or within nutrition bars, kind of female-founded startups sell more to women. And so entrepreneurs create new goods for consumers of similar gender, age, and geography as well, we found for phone apps. So if a phone app startup starts in Minnesota, there's a huge home state effect to that particular startup. We also found similar ideas across industries as well. And then the paper provides a few additional results, kind of this more general idea of social background influencing the type of innovation you're working on. So we've looked at kind of social impact, kind of clean versus traditional energy, and kind of descriptions of these startups between male and female startups. And then we also kind of go a little further. I think there's been talk about the role of funders in this particular setting. And so women VC partners are more likely to fund women founders, but even kind of beyond that, they're also separately predictive of the direction of innovation as well. So even when they fund a male founded startup, they're likely to pick ideas that end up turning into products that are more useful to women consumers. So there's lots to unpack, and I sometimes like focus is an issue. So like if you have suggestions for like what is more important here, especially to practitioners and policymakers, then I'm certainly all ears on that front to dig a little bit deeper into this area. In the few remaining minutes, maybe 1 minute, we also, so the first part of our study is just purely descriptive. Then we kind of run a quasi experiment. This is very difficult to do. We're trying to kind of find variation in a person's background that's random and then track their subsequent entrepreneurial activity. It's a little bit hard to do in the US context, but if you guys have thoughts on that, that would be really helpful. But I think the solution was to go look in Finland, and to summarize what we find is that if your peers in your college program are from a richer background, you're more likely to subsequently start a business in a luxury goods industry. And these effects are driven by individuals with above median parental income. So they seem to be the most sensitive to having low income peers and then deciding to start businesses in a more necessities-based industry. And peers don't seem to be affecting entrepreneurial income, so how well you do or like how much money you make. And then it doesn't seem to affect the probability of becoming an entrepreneur. So I've kind of blitzed through some of the results in our paper. I hope you take a look at it and send us suggestions. To summarize, innovators' backgrounds and experiences affect the types of new goods they create. This speaks to policies such as the SBIR, which are interested in promoting equitable growth. And our research suggests that they might, if they kind of focus a little bit more on some of the aspects of their programs. This also speaks to kind of hiring and funding decisions and maybe kind of the managing of patent inventors at big companies as well. So lots of future work to be done, but thank you for tuning in.
Thank you very much. I do have one question to share with you. So the question is, if entrepreneurs of certain genders, age, geography have extra barriers to start up, are you able to estimate the value of consumer goods and services that the economy misses out on as a whole?
Yeah, that's right. So we tried to do it a couple ways in like the third part of the paper, which I was clearly not going to get to in this talk, but we do it in a couple of different ways, kind of using tools from economics, which obviously are limited in some sense, and they miss potentially some of the extra gains that come from entrepreneurship as well. But yeah, we've tried to quantify it, and the effect seems somewhat large, like in terms of inequality and kind of missed growth as well, that the barriers create. So if you remove the barriers, you kind of get kind of 2% percentage point higher growth per year and maybe kind of 15% less inequality. So that was kind of a calibration of a stylized model, but that's a back of the envelope calculation. Some people have estimated it to be like even bigger. So I think it is a first order issue, just given kind of the imbalance in where we're drawing kind of innovators from. So I do think it's a first order issue, to summarize kind of my response.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was our main question. And I encourage anyone else to, if you have any other questions for Dr. Feng, then feel free to drop those in the chat. And I'm going to, excuse me, introduce our next speaker. This next presentation is going to focus on place-based impacts of the Build from Within Alliance. And I'd like to introduce Mr. Jacob Rosch, and also perhaps at some point his colleague Ira Goldstein, but take it away, and we'd love to hear more about this work.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Let me share the screen here. All right, great. Well, thanks everybody, and thank you, Lauren and Derek and everyone from the Kauffman Foundation for inviting us here today, and also, of course, supporting this research. And I also want to especially thank our partners in this research. I'm here presenting this, but we're joined in this project by SIAP, the Social Impact of the Arts Project at Penn, and most importantly, the Build from Within Alliance. So just a quick little bit about us. My name is Jacob Rosch. As I said, I work with an organization called the Reinvestment Fund. We're a CDFI, which is a mission-driven financial institution. We make loans and grants and all things that communities need to be vital and successful places. I work for a research team within the organization that works with our lenders, but also external partners, as I'm here today talking about, to understand the sort of markets that we're working in. So this project is really a collaboration with an organization called the Build From Within Alliance, and they're really the star of the show here. So I just want to tell you a little bit about them before I get into our research project. So Build From Within Alliance is a national network of community development organizations that are each working to support local entrepreneurs and neighborhood development. And so you can see a map of all of the members of the Alliance here. They're really all over the country. They're all a little bit different, but all of them are really focused on using entrepreneurship and working with marginalized communities, often immigrant communities, to support community development and economic growth and really neighborhood transformation. So they have a really unique and interesting model. I'm not going to get too far into that, but I definitely encourage you to check out their website. You can see sort of the components of the model on the bottom of the slide there. You know, it includes sort of unique business training, technical assistance, lending component, but also critically a real estate component, because this is really place-based work, and that is partly what drew us together to sort of do this research. So our project is called Generational Wealth Through Place-Based Entrepreneurship, and our goal was to understand, how the work of Alliance members could actually impact the places where they're doing this work. When we're talking about entrepreneurship and business development, often sort of the high level numbers are things like, business started, jobs created, dollars raised. But I think we can all agree, and many of the presentations today have already highlighted, entrepreneurship has all of these other effects. It makes places more vibrant and interesting. It has a number of sort of spillover effects into communities. And so what we set out to do here is understand what are the associations that we can observe between the work that Alliance members are doing in specific places within cities and neighborhoods, and measures of those places, the well-being specifically in those places. So our project looks at 10 Build From Within Alliance member cities, and they're really a diverse list of places. And within each, we're asking these three questions. First, what are the characteristics of these cities? And what are the associations that we can see between characteristics of places and where Build From Within Alliance members are doing their work? Along the way, we're kind of sharing that information, working very collaboratively with the members themselves to understand, how they're interpreting the results that we're creating, the different analyses that we're generating, and how this, aligns with their understanding of their own impact and their understanding of their own places. So just to summarize, in other words, what we're trying to do here is understand more about the sort of ecosystem within which all of these entrepreneurs are working and the sort of feedback that happens between that ecosystem, the work of members, and how they're actually influencing the sort of their context. That was very high level. Let me tell you a little bit more about what we're actually doing. This is an active project. We're kind of halfway through our 2-year timeline. And what you see on the slide here is a summary of what we're actually kind of measuring. When we started this project, we worked with the Build From Within Alliance to identify, 3 kind of dimensions of place, of ways that people measure or think about the sort of well-being of a place, and identified measures of those specific dimensions. And each of these tells us something about sort of the local neighborhood conditions in which they're doing their work, and also the broader neighborhood in which our cities within which their neighborhoods exist. So the first dimension that we are looking at is what we're calling neighborhood vitality. Where are the places where this work is happening? Places that are experiencing population loss and disinvestment. Are they neighborhoods that are experiencing rapid change? They have high demand housing markets. And to understand all of that, we're using an analysis called the market value analysis, or MVA. This is a tool that cities and other sort of housing advocates use to understand housing markets and create sort of a typology of places and neighborhoods. And so it tells us, really important information about the sort of strength and challenges of specific neighborhoods and sub-markets. The next dimension that we set out to understand was social well-being and economic opportunity. I think all of us would agree well-being is more than just, kind of the amount of money you make. It's really your health, your connection to arts and culture, your ability to live in sort of a stable place. And so what we did is worked with our partners at SciAp, and they have sort of over time pioneered this approach to measuring the well-being of places, which they call the social well-being index or indices. It's a quantitative way of sort of measuring different dimensions of well-being. So things like the health of people in a community, the level of economic opportunity, connections people have to social services and arts and cultures organization, all these different dimensions of the sort of abstract concept of well-being, we can sort of measure in a sort of place-based way. And then finally, all of the alliance members that we spoke with told us that gentrification and displacement of people and businesses was something they were all thinking about. And so we are using a measure we call the displacement risk ratio, which is a quantitative way of assessing the sort of risk that individual places have of experiencing resident displacement due to rising home prices. So we're conducting these 3 sort of analyses in each of our cities. And then we're combining all of that, of course, along the way with interviews and focus groups with city partners and entrepreneurs to understand how these results are sort of aligning or not with their understanding of their communities. You can see along the right side of your screen the list of cities that we're conducting this analysis in. As I said, we're sort of halfway through the project, and we've done our analysis in 5 of the 10 cities. And they're pretty diverse places. We've got Anchorage and Miami, which is about probably as far apart as you could get, but also big urban cities like Philadelphia, like Houston, and smaller cities, more rural areas as well. So in the last couple minutes, I thought I would just share some of the sort of early findings and sort of lessons we're learning along the way. As I said, we've only had an opportunity to sort of do our analysis in 5 of these 10 cities. But these are just sort of some of our sort of high level takeaways from conversations with local partners and entrepreneurs and alliance members. So the first is that we're finding that the housing context within these cities is very different. And I think if you looked at that list of cities, that's pretty obvious. A city like Miami is experiencing incredibly high runaway home prices. And that's a very different context in other cities like maybe a Detroit or a Wilmington. And that sort of context has important implications for the role of Built from Within Alliance members and the role that they're playing within their specific neighborhood. So in stronger markets, Alliance members are working in neighborhoods often that are changing rapidly. And so the businesses that they're helping to support and create are really sort of anchoring the communities that live in those neighborhoods now and provide sort of an anchor to help them feel connected to a place that might otherwise be changing very rapidly. Whereas in sort of weaker markets that are experiencing more divestment and population loss, the role of Build from Within Alliance members is really creating sort of the assets and amenities that are helping convince residents to sort of stay in their communities as their economic opportunity increases. Second, we're seeing that measuring some of these more non-financial outcomes helps underscore the broader role that entrepreneurs are playing in communities. One of the sort of dimensions of well-being that we're measuring is the connection to things like social services and nonprofits and civic organizations. And one of the things that we found is that in many cities, the areas where this work is happening often lack sort of traditional concentrations of things like nonprofits or formal arts organizations. And one of the things the members told us is that that's something they're very aware of. And so part of what they're building into their training and technical assistance is really sort of that leadership development and creating opportunities actually for their entrepreneurs to be the civic leaders in their communities. And that's sort of an important role that they're playing within their communities. And then finally, conversations around displacement tend to generate a lot of heat, but not a lot of light. And that's because people use terms like gentrification, displacement to mean a lot of different things. And so bringing some data to this can help sort of ground those conversations, but also arm these organizations with information they need to have real productive conversations with civic leaders, political leaders, and other stakeholders. So with that, Lauren, I think you are back on the screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for covering all of that. And we do have a couple of questions. One here in the chat is, for the qual metrics and data tools you use for this research, what type of information are you collecting and how are you computing them to determine the value of something like well-being?
Yeah, definitely. So we're combining a lot of different data sources for each of these analysis. For our analysis of sort of neighborhood vitality, we're looking at a lot of administrative data from cities on things like home prices, incidents of permitting and renovation, vacancy, sort of all of these sort of indicators of the sort of physical condition and characteristics of markets, things that you would look at to understand sort of the level of strength of sort of the housing market. For the social well-being indices, we're also combining a number of different measures. So data often pulled from different census and sort of national data sets on things like where we see nonprofits being registered based on tax records, different health data that we can gather, at sort of a small enough geography to be able to do the analysis we're looking at, but also things like many of our dimensions look at things like inclusion and exclusion and diversity and segregation. And there we're pulling in sort of census population information. Yeah.
Thank you. And then a couple of others here. One question, great presentation. Can you say more about why you did not choose any rural places or why they're not part of this current study?
Yeah, so actually we do have one, I would classify as a rural area. So one of the cities we're actually looking at right now is in St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is a pretty rural area. But our work is driven by, we wanted to select only built within Alliance member cities. So it's partly driven by where they are. But we do actually have a couple rural communities, and depending on what you think Anchorage, Alaska is, whether that classifies as rural or urban or some third classification, it's a pretty diverse list of places.
And then finally, is there a paper or report available? Or maybe you can say a little bit more about how people can continue to follow this work, whether it's a paper, or report, or how can we stay tuned on the insights that you're generating?
Yeah, definitely. So we are working on putting together sort of a first paper, which would be, kind of our early lessons from year one. I definitely, if you're interested in this work, certainly follow up with me, but also I would recommend following the Built Within Alliance. As I said, they're very much our partner. We're not just sort of studying them, they're also very much helping us lead this research, and they're doing a lot to gather this information that we're collecting, share it with these individual groups and share it out in that way. I would also add, right now we're very much in the sort of analysis phase of our project, but as we begin to complete our analyses, part of our goal in starting this project was to package our findings in ways that were useful for members and of the Alliance and also others. So very much hoping to, at the end of this process, we'll have not only some guides, but to do this kind of work in your own community, but also ways to think about how to talk about these different types of studies and how they relate to entrepreneurship and the work that entrepreneurs are doing.
Yeah, that was maybe even one of my questions, but I think you kind of answered it. I mean, it will be interesting to see how the Build From Within Alliance really uses these insights, given that there's different contexts in each location and how the materials can help other folks working in different ecosystems think differently about the different factors of their own ecosystems when making programs similar. So I think that there will be some pretty interesting stuff there. Thank you very much, Jacob, for your time. And last and definitely not least is the topic of our next presentation, which is on citizen entrepreneurship, creating social impact through research. And I want to welcome Dr. Shane Snipes and also Miss Jessica Pitts to talk with us more about this work. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to share with you guys the progress that we've been making when it comes to our program and the ways that we've been expanding thanks to the support of the Kauffman Foundation. So this is an overview of some of the partners that we've started out with. And to give you a brief history of where we are, I want you to first off understand this was formed within the context of a community college. And so we were immediately thinking about how do you expand the research pool with regards to getting undergrads involved in the research careers, understanding what research means, And then how do you weave that component of entrepreneurship into it? And you'll see why entrepreneurship is such an important piece of this as we go through the information. We were really thinking about what is some ways that business discovery can become community first or community first centered. And that meant that we had to get the students and the places that they lived directly involved. In the beginning, when we were doing this project, I have to say, Jessica Pitts has been with me since the project started to evolve and grow and expand into other colleges. And I just wanted to say it's very nice to have her within the context of this work. I run the entrepreneurship degree program at BMCC. That's why I was initially hired. And now we've since gotten the grant from Kauffman to expand the curriculum for Citizen Entrepreneur Explorers program. And that's one of the foundational pieces of what we're doing at BMCC. So at BMCC, we have our entrepreneurship degree, which is a 2-year degree. We also now have a Blackstone Launchpad, which is a 3-year funded project, which offers an open space for anyone from any major to discover entrepreneurial mindset and innovative thinking. And then SEEP is our way that the classroom and after-school programs and other educators can now actually discover and weave research, neighborhood discovery, and entrepreneurship into their programs. So we've made SEEP into this modular kind of opportunity for educators. What SEEP actually does is it teaches research skills that folks can use in all aspects of their lives. Initially, when we were doing this work, as I mentioned, we were a 2-year college, and our goal was to give them skills that might make them more employable, might make them more attractive for folks who are likely to hire people with 2-year degrees. And now we found that some of our partners, as you saw on the prior slide, like NYU and some of the high schools, are now interested in bringing this type of curriculum in as well. The ultimate goal, remember, this is Kauffman, and so we're all about research, is to expand the pipeline and the diversity of researchers within the context of entrepreneurship. And we're doing that with this methodology. We also connect students to their neighborhoods and allow them to explore entrepreneurship by getting them to ask a very specific question. So through the process of this program, what we uncovered is that students weren't just asking questions, but because of the way the program is designed, they were giving back that information to their neighborhood. So this doesn't go onto a scholarly journal necessarily. It could be in an undergraduate research conference. It could be in something like that. But more importantly, it's delivered back to the community so they can understand it. I want to offer some examples here because it's really important that folks like Janae, who wanted to study whether businesses recognized that homelessness was an issue. What she found is that customers were aware of homelessness, but the subgroup thought that they didn't believe there was an obligation for businesses to give back. So 50% of those didn't, 45% of them thought it was important. But what the businesses actually said, 85% of them said they didn't want to do anything about homelessness. So there was a sense of shock in the report back scenario for Janae, where community center attendees were like, what's going on? Our businesses aren't even interested in homelessness here. So that raised a whole issue of questions, and she was able to have a very vibrant discussion with those community members. And that's just one example of how the student was able to bring ideas to the neighborhood, and the community was able to have a dialogue about what businesses might do in the future. So advocacy is one of those pieces. The actual steps of SEEP are this: find a research question, decide how to gather your data, gather that data, review it, and then report back to the community. We go deeper at each of those steps by thinking about, is it purposeful, relevant, bold, and personal? When we see this, that means under the purposeful in question, how is this research question addressing a current community need? And under the idea of how do we analyze or assess it? And under the bold category, which is the other section, how do you use new or creative assessment options in your research? Those are some of the ways that we broaden and expand what students are actually discovering in the process. Now, Jessica is going to actually introduce us to Khalil.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so this project was done by a student. They were interested in seeing how like the community engagement impacted the success of a business. So what they found was in the next slide, what they found was that this business harnessed the power of community engagement, with more residents in the neighborhood saying that they would purchase from and trust the business more that engaged in community engagement. So this particular business that they looked at was a record store that held block parties, talked with people in the neighborhood, and was overall engaged. So they were engaged with this. Also, this is the place Malcolm X grassroots movement as a community action organization in that student's neighborhood, and they were also engaged with that organization. So speaking to the community about their needs and what was important to them was a very central to the success of this business. So it just highlights kind of the social impact that the research can have. So this is a big revelation for a lot of businesses, because they could use this to engage with their customers and the neighborhood in general.
Excellent. And I'll just add to that, when we're looking at the information that's here, the goal of how we develop things, not just at the SEEP program, but inside of BMCC, is to say, what is our impact going to be? How can we do some type of discovery around it? How do we ask a question about that discovery? How do we engage the community? And then how do you either start from one end and go the other direction, or start from the high level and go down? So we can teach it from either perspective, which is exciting for these undergraduate students. Some of them want to approach it from a neighborhood perspective. Some of them come at it from a big question perspective. The other piece I would add is what we're measuring with the SEEP components are entrepreneurial self-efficacy, which for the people who take part in the SEEP program, they've seen an improvement of about 34%. And that's a difference of about 10 or 15% from what they normally would get for my other research with it, which is around mindfulness. So the SEEP program itself is actually engaging the students more in their belief and their ability to be entrepreneurial. And then the relevance to the community leaders, the leaders who were able to contact were able to tell us, 79% of them said, this is very relevant to us. Thank you for sharing this information. It may have been church leaders. It may have been other things. And then the student research inclination increased by about 21%. And we're thinking and looking at their the types of questions that I asked them to reflect on in their journals near the end of the class. And they were saying the research-centric careers were something that they were looking at. The last example is Taylor. He's the one that wanted to look into his Harlem community and ways that it might be affected by gentrification. What we found in his analysis was restaurant and bars should give back to the community. That was something that he saw very widely in the sample size that he had. You can see he was able to assess a small sample size. These research projects are small because they're over the course of a semester, and it's only part of a class. It's not the entire course or the entire assignment for a particular class. And this gives them a taste of what it's like to do their research. He reported it back to his church where he has gone before. So he was able to go into one of the church meetings and introduce it to them. And it was interesting that they said, there's an opportunity for us to find a middle ground in which all are taking care of one another. And this type of data is helpful for that sort of information. I want to say thank you guys so much for your time. You can find out more about us here. We also have a LinkedIn group that we are launching, and it has some people who are currently using the program and other folks who are interested in possibly starting it. So I welcome questions from you guys, and I look forward to expanding and continuing to grow the pipeline of diverse researchers.
Thank you both very much. We have a wonderful question that I think will kind of help deepen your presentation too, from Susan Cohen, who shared, they said, really interesting research questions and approach to engaging the community. Could you offer 1 or 2 lessons on how to effectively engage student researchers with community actors? What did you try that did not work or was surprisingly successful on the road to developing this process?
So Jessica, I'd love for you to dive in a little bit and talk about some of the things that we found when we were making sure that students did actually engage with their neighborhoods and ways that we've evolved. I'll talk about the ways that we've evolved it.
Yeah, from working with students, we've like cast a wide net. So helping students think outside of the box of what community engagement looks like. So students are like, okay, well, there isn't this business organization in my neighborhood. So we try to work with them and like, okay, is there a church? Is there a place where residents gather where you can report your findings back so that you can engage in a dialogue? So that's been really helpful, I think, for a lot of students in helping them think outside the box of what is the community and where they can report their findings back to.
Yeah, and that evolution has happened over time as students have come to us with really interesting examples of how they want to present it or where they want to present it to. And they also find it hard to do that 5th step. They find it really hard, even though we ask them to do pre-work on it and to go out and discover a list of organizations that are within a certain radius of number of blocks of their home, because we want it to feel like neighborhood engagement and not just reporting this back to, their class or reporting it back to an organization in another part of town. We want it to be an ongoing dialogue. The other part of this is fascinating is the data sets that these students are creating. We're now starting to create some anonymization in them and allowing other students to pick the question that another student has done in another place and then add to that data set. So there's opportunities for that kind of stacking of information and for it to grow within a network effect across the country or even the world. So.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for this presentation and sharing more about how you're working so deeply with neighborhoods, communities, and students. And I think with that, we will wrap up for today. I want to thank everyone who has joined us, especially all of the Knowledge Challenge grantees who presented today. It's been wonderful to hear some of the deeper insights that are coming out of the work that you're doing. And so on behalf of the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, thank you very much. And we look forward to hearing or seeing all of you at some of our upcoming forums. There are links to those and you'll be seeing that on our social media and also upcoming newsletters. And we will be having additional forums upcoming to highlight additional Knowledge Challenge grantees. So we look forward to seeing you all there, and thanks again.